Okay, welcome to, an inaugural for us, first virtual site presentation. My name is Teresa Folger. With me, I have Kevin Graziano, Denise Schmidt-Crawford, and David Slykeis. And we were the editors, the guest editors for a special edition of the Journal of Technology and Teacher Education recently, titled Preparing All Teacher Educators to Support Teacher Candidates Integration of Technology. And we have a very special presentation for you today, something for you to think about in terms of the exciting papers that were published in that edition, as well as some conversations with the authors who published those papers. So, what are the TETCs? A couple of years ago, Denise, Kevin, and I began this journey of thinking about what competencies teacher educators need who are supporting programs that address technology integration for their teacher candidates across the breadth of their program rather than in the isolated technology integration course. And through efforts that you may have participated in, the TETCs came to be, the Teacher Educator Technology Competencies. I know you're watching this not live, so if you feel the need to pause for just a minute and go look at those TETCs, the URL is right there.
Hi, everyone. Denise Crawford. This was a very special project for us in our development of the TETCs, where we contacted Rick Ferdig, the editor of JTATE, and asked if we could have a special issue. And we felt that using the TETCs as a basis for this issue, but also just the idea of how could we gather a set of papers that would provide us with a very strong foundational understanding of how others in our community are preparing our teacher candidates and our teacher educators then indirectly for a level of commitment to have that knowledge of the TETCs. And so we sought that, and this is actually a collection of that.
Okay, so we have 5 facilitators today, 5 papers that is. Let's see, some papers have multiple facilitators. The first paper that we will present that will be discussed in a moment is entitled Practical Cases of Teacher Educators' Experiences, a review of faculty development models that build teacher educators' technology competencies. And that will be facilitated by Andrea Parrish and William Sudera. The second paper today is Assessing the TETCs, Validation of a Teacher Educator Technology Competencies Survey. And that will be presented and is authored by Gerald Konecek and Rhonda Christensen. The third paper today, Experiences Applying the TETCs, Adapting TETCs in Integrated Elementary Mathematics and Technology Coursework, a collaborative self-study of 2 teacher educators, will be discussed by Amanda Thomas and her colleagues who are not present today, Dana Peterson and Fitsum Abibi. The fourth paper today is Recommendations for Organizational Change, Teacher Educator Technology Integration Initiative, Addressing the Technology Preparation Gap. And those authors are not with us today, but that will be summarized and briefly discussed by Denise Schmidt-Crawford. The fifth paper today, we have both of the authors with us, and that is Foregrounding Technoethics Toward Critical Perspectives in Technology and Teacher Education. And that is authored and will be facilitated by Daniel Krutka and Marie Heath. So our agenda, before we get started quickly, each facilitator has approximately 6 to 7 minutes to discuss their research. They will present their study, a summary of their study, their research, talk about the implications for teacher preparation, and then shift to areas for further research. Our first presenter today is, again, Practical Cases, a review of faculty development models that build teacher educators' technology competencies. And I'm proud to turn this over to Andrea Parrish and William Sedera.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to present. My name is Andrea Parrish, and we're going to be sharing with you the results of a literature review, specifically a review on faculty development models. So the purpose of this review was to examine faculty development literature to identify promising models that could then be applied to the TETCs. And so one of the things that we did in our scope was we included faculty development that included a look at the culture of academia. And what we found is that the culture of academia often presents sort of has contributed to a fragmented focus. And we've also got contextual factors that impact how teacher preparation programs offer faculty development to teacher educators. Factors like the ISTE standards, CAPE standards, the TETCs themselves and the nature of the competencies, but then also educator preparation program leadership has their own expectations. And so sometimes those influence the faculty development that is offered. Overall in the paper, we summarize faculty development efforts that could be a good match for the TETCs as falling into these three primary categories, or what we refer to in the paper as promising models. And so these are categorized into mentoring, and not just traditional mentoring, but mutual mentoring amongst faculty. Mutually beneficial partnerships, most of those are partnerships between local school districts and folks in a teacher preparation program working together to develop their technology competencies, and then communities of practice.
Hi, I'm Bill Sedera. I'll pick up the presentation from here. Thank you, Andrea. And thank you all for having us and for allowing us to share our work with you. The results of this research produced a series of recommendations, as Andrea had mentioned, that help us to decide and to think about how to effectively implement professional development. The research recommendations are as follows, as well as some examples that I'll share. First, the research showed that preparing professional development for faculty needs to be grounded in adult learning theories and in andragogy. And Knowles argued that that should be done through learning experiences that are self-directed and allow for choice and active role for the participants in the learning process. Some examples from the literature review include teachers' practices with allowing participants to share control and decision-making power and participating in socially negotiated communities of practice. Snyder talked about using coaching models to allow for faculty to capitalize on experiences of others and encourage problem solving. Another example of professional development practices using adult learning theories was Knowlton's research, in which faculty identified purposes for learning and allowed them to construct curriculum materials that they could later use in their own teaching. In order to allow adult learners opportunities for choice, some examples talked about faculty developing activities where they preferred technology and the combination of technology and content. Teacher educators indicated that they valued informal learning opportunities that were specifically tailored to their individual needs, and that they valued the chance to share what they knew about the integration of technology with their colleagues. It's important to acknowledge that faculty development of technology-based competencies doesn't need to progress in a linear manner, but rather we should consider flexible strategies, flexible mentoring models, and the use of a variety of instructional approaches that extend over a period of time, sometimes more than just one academic year. Collectively, the researchers argued for embedding faculty development in technology integration within a context of teaching and learning, rather than presenting skills in isolation. Finally, it's essential that educator preparation programs and leaders of those programs and technology educators involve faculty in planning professional development needs. And make sure that you're aware of the research and the resources available to support these endeavors. Kevin, who's with us this afternoon, as well as others, prepared the TPAC diagnostic tool, and that serves as a great example of a way to measure where faculty are and allow to make good plans before, during, and after the implementation of professional development initiatives. In order to gain a better understanding, I think this is the next slide, Teresa. In order to gain a better understanding of the impact of faculty development and our ability to help teachers, educators reach their technology integration goals, we must continue to do research. We must apply promising models such as those presented in this article. These efforts go beyond accountability. Faculty development of this kind makes certain that teacher educators are able to model effective technology integration so that teacher candidates can effectively teach with technology when they enter their classrooms. The results of this research argued for strategies for how professional development is implemented, the development of a TETC diagnostic tool similar to the one that will be presented by Gerald in the next few slides in the next article. Use a variety of professional developments that implement the TETC maybe as mile markers, and develop a deeper collective understanding of TETC and related criteria themselves, so everyone involved in faculty development has a firm grasp on the end goal. Finally, we must continue to pursue opportunities to share the results of our efforts through publication and presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea and Bill. The next article, Assessing the TETCs, Validation of a Teacher Educator Technology Competencies Survey, will be discussed and presented by Gerald Konezek and Rhonda Christensen.
Well, thank you. And hello, everyone. Hello from two corners of Texas, actually. I'm already admiring the order of these, so I'll commend the people who scheduled this. Dr. Christensen and I will take turns speaking on different slides. We've been building self-efficacy instruments for about 30 years. And so we thought we would try a simple task to take the competencies as a blueprint and write a very quick and dirty one-page instrument that would be a Likert-style rating scale. And if you can go to the next slide, Teresa, we'll look at those. And so it's just 12 items. What we did is take the heart of each competency and make it as the target of the phrase, I feel confident that I could. We arranged the order slightly. For those of us schooled in classical measurement, you should always try to start with some item that's more or less a no-brainer, that's easy, that does not impose much cognitive load, and sort of keep the heart, the jugular, for the end. So we moved competencies 1, 2, and 3 to the bottom because they're really the core in our view of the teacher preparation part of it. And it did turn out that item number 1 on our instrument competency 4 was the highest agreement overall of the 223 teacher preparation faculty that completed this instrument. They were from 3 continents. The purpose was not for us to draw any grand conclusions. It was really just to see if we could build a simple instrument that might be useful for some of the purposes that we'll be talking about. So I'll turn this over to Rhonda for the next slide and then come back. Next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Gerald. As he mentioned, the initial study we gathered data from 223 teacher educators, and perhaps some of you were some of those educators, teacher educators from multiple sources, including CITE, as well as various teacher education programs around the world. The survey has high internal consistency and reliability. We found an alpha of 0.94, so felt good about that. We verified the construct validity through factor analysis and found that the survey instrument can be one factor and explains 64% of the common variance. However, we also found that there are 3 possible subscales. They emerged with factor analysis as well, and they have really strong alphas. Gerald's going to show a picture of that in a moment, but there were 3 different ones with a 0.92, a 0.89, and a 0.83. So there's different parts that it might be important to look at as teacher preparation programs. Several implications for teacher preparation include not just teaching with technology, but how you model technology and how to use it all across all subject areas. So those are important pieces to look at in programs. This actual survey could be used by teacher preparation programs to establish a baseline level, perhaps, and just to kind of see where you are and where you need to go. It might be useful for self-reflection, and also might be useful for pre-post kind of intervention. If you do something in your program and you want to see what changes happened through the program. So there's different ways to do that, to find out how confident teacher educators are with teaching with technology with their students. So I hope that you'll find that useful. Back to you, Gerald.
All right, so the next slide for future research. I was really struck by Bill's comment that not all competencies might proceed in unison or necessarily in a linear fashion. The findings we have for the subscale certainly indicate that. We can gather these into 3 kinds of categories for the competencies that are there. The first one on the upper right in my screen is instructional practices, and this is how the faculty perceive themselves as teachers. That is, how good they are at teaching, conveying content. In the middle, the heart of this is teacher preparation competencies, and you'll see there's a cluster of items there. This is what the faculty, in our view, are seeing as what they role model for their teacher preparation candidates. These are the skills that they hope to convey to the teacher preparation candidates, as opposed to the instructional practices, which have to do with, can you handle online learning and things like that, which the people who responded to this instrument tend to see that as their own skill set, as opposed to what they're conveying to others. I'll point out item 9 and come back to it in a moment. It's the one in the lower left corner there by teacher preparation, if you can see it, because in some sense it belongs with appropriate uses. Appropriate uses are the 3rd factor. They are put together only because really they don't belong in either of the first 2. And so in some sense, we could easily separate item 5, use technology to connect globally with a variety of regions and cultures. Item 6, address the legal, ethical, and socially responsible uses of technology. Item 8, engage in leadership and advocacy for using technology. Each of those could probably be developed into a domain of their own if that was important for some uses in the future. But I think that most of you online that have been involved in site type activities for a lot of years would agree that these are all a little bit periphery to the basic idea of how good of a teacher are you in your preparation of candidates, and then what kind of skills do they need to have. Of course, what we're talking about definitely is in the center of 21st century skills in that 3rd category of appropriate uses. And I'll return and end with item 9. Item 9 is apply basic troubleshooting skills to resolve technology issues. Well, certainly we would hope our pre-service teachers could do that, but in some sense, they belong over with assuming your technology always worked. Then you could think of that as a peripheral item too, and you can see that it's a little further away in this multi-dimensional scaling diagram from the others. I believe we've taken up our 6 minutes, and so I'll close with that. A lot more in the paper. Would invite you to read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. Thank you, Rhonda. The next article written by Amanda Thomas and her colleagues, is entitled Experiences Applying TETCs, Adopting TETCs in Integrated Elementary Mathematics and Technology Coursework, a collaborative self-study of 2 teacher educators. And Amanda Thomas will present the article on behalf of her colleagues.
Thank you. So we drew heavily upon Harris, Mishra, and Kohler's 2009 recommendations that teacher ed programs shift from technocratic approaches to TPAC development and toward more complex interpretations that focus on instructional planning. And to do this, we thought of this in the context of the Teacher Education Technology Competencies. And we worked together to engage in self-study over the course of about 1.5 years, and that's still ongoing. So we wanted to shift from learning about technology to learning what technology or what teaching with technology can be for students. And we thought we were doing that before, but through the self-study realized we had more opportunity to do that when we tried to align that with the TETCs. So, perfect, thank you. We followed the model for self-study proposed by Louis in 2003, which was 3 phases: assessment, implementation, and dissemination. And these corresponded with the 3 phases of our work. The first phase, which happened mostly in fall, a fall semester going into spring, which was to look at our own practices in relation to the TETCs. And then phase 2 was more along the lines of implementation, where once we had done that initial assessment of where we thought we were, then we looked at what sort of revisions should we make? How can we make changes based off of where we thought we were in relation to the TETCs? And then in phase 3, that would be the dissemination, which is not only dissemination through things like this particular article, but also to scale up to disseminate these ideas with other colleagues. And that's the stage that we're in right now. So when we did this, one of the things we did was to take all of the TETCs and each individual criteria and initially rate ourselves as to how we thought we were addressing that. So was it 0, not at all, up to 3, which was extensively. So we just rated ourselves as not a validated instrument at this point, but this is how we approach the self-study. And then just constantly engaged in collaboration amongst ourselves with a lot of reflection and discussion as to how we could move forward working together across the technology course and the math education course. So we're thinking about technology in the context of teaching mathematics. And so we basically had the pre and the post for that, pre being during phase 1, post being during phase 2. And we were able to document a number of challenges with the TETC adoption. One of the big ones was that what we intended wasn't always what we ended up doing. So although, for instance, attending to differentiating with technology for diverse populations, although we thought that was important, when we really more closely examined how we modeled that within our courses, we realized we weren't quite doing it justice. So the TETCs and the specific criteria helped us to identify that and then to make changes based off of that. That's just one example of it. We also made a number of revisions. So we changed some of the things in our syllabus. We would change assignments. For instance, with lesson planning, we realized that our expectations could be better scaffolded. And so based off of the criteria, we were able to change that a little bit. We found that the collaboration, not just that we were collaborating within teaching courses for the same students, but also collaborating through the process of self-study was quite useful for us and helped us to broaden the TETC adoption and scale up to this phase 3 where we're working with additional educators. We also looked at a second research question about what was the impact on the students, because if the goal is to have students eventually, by teacher educators having technology competency, we want students to eventually be able to do that as well. And teacher candidates, we did some pre-post TPAC surveys and kind of looked at that through the lens of TETC 3 and found that remained consistent. So we weren't doing any harm in that respect. Maybe get to the next one, perfect. So in terms of implication for teacher preparation, the process of self-study was quite reflective, and looking at this with that level of detail was helpful for us and helpful to share because we felt that for institutions, programs, or just individuals who want to align with the TETCs, this is not a top-down approach. We were able to do that just the two of us, but it could be, right? This is something that could be facilitated program-wide. We found it to be flexible. It's a way to accommodate a variety of comfort levels with technology and pace it in a way that makes sense for us, and then to connect across research and teaching practice. Going forward, of course, at the time we were doing this, we didn't realize the tool that was already discussed previously, but what we did is not a validated, reliable tool in terms of just 0 to 3, where do we think we're at with each of the criteria, but continued development and dissemination of reliable tools for measuring and understanding TETC adoption and implementation will be useful for the kind of work that we did. And then the other area of future research for us is expanding. So it started off with just 2 of us, instructional technology and math, but we teach our courses in a block with science educators as well and other math educators. And so now we're expanding to do this kind of work across a number of additional educators within our group and looking at the impact of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. The next article that appeared in the JTATE special issue is entitled Organizational Change, Teacher Educator Technology Integration Initiative, Addressing the Technology Preparation Gap. The authors of this research are Yang Cheng and Deborah Dillon. They are not present today, so our colleague David Slikheis will give a summary and quick overview of this research. David.
Thank you, Kevin. This article fits into the flow of the special issue here as we go from how the TETCs were applied in the self-study that you just heard about to how the TETCs were applied a little bit more systematically across a teacher education preparation program. In this case, at this university, there was already a push to integrate technology more formally into their teacher education program, and in particular, to do that through some work with their teacher educators and how they could do that. They had just begun a pilot study on how they could more effectively integrate technology when the TETCs were first published. And so when the TETCs came out, they basically took the TETCs and used them to calibrate their progress as they were going through, how effective were they being, and to really focus on what their implementation of this was going to be. After their pilot study, they basically ramped up to the entire college and the teacher education program, and the TETCs really became the focus of what they were doing. And so different departments and different units chose different TETCs to concentrate on as what they were really going to focus on implementing over the next year. And then they partnered with some technology faculty as well to get some assistance in putting those into play. And one of the really interesting things about this is this whole project started as a grant-funded project in the college to improve their technology competencies of the faculty. But by the time that they really ramped it up and were running it full bore across the entire college, this went post-grant, and they saw enough value in it that they found a way to continue to implement this process of focusing on a TETC and getting it in, and then moving on and looking at another one and doing this throughout their program, and kept it in beyond the life of the grant funding. So it's an excellent article to look at applying the TETCs across an entire unit and how that can change the preparation of the teacher educators that are doing this, and how it affects the teacher candidates.
Thank you, David. The final paper today, written by Daniel Krutka and Marie Heath and colleagues, is entitled Foregrounding Techno-Ethics Toward Critical Perspectives in Technology and Teacher Education. And Daniel and Marie are with us today to discuss their research a bit more.
Dan, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Marie. Classic Zoom foul. So thank you all for having us. I first just want to recognize we do have a third author on the paper who wasn't going to present at the conference, which is why they're not on this slide. But Brett Stott-Willett at the Michigan State University was also an author and collaborator on this paper. So I'll get the discussion started, and then Dr. Heath is going to take over from there and kind of explain where this is going. So this paper is called Foregrounding Techno-Ethics Toward Critical Perspectives in Technology and Teacher Education. And you can see by my pictures on the slide right here that we reference Jurassic Park. And if you notice behind me, I've got the Matrix going behind me. So I'm into movies that were big when I was growing up. And so the reason we reference Jurassic Park is we see Jurassic Park as essentially being about techno-ethical conundrums. We can develop science, we can develop technology, but for what purposes? And so you have the famous quote from the chaos scientist in the movie, Ian Malcolm, who said, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think whether they should." And we think this is an important question for thinking about the role of technologies in schools. A lot of other, theorists and scholars in the field have raised these questions, from Neil Selwyn to Audrey Waters to most recently a lot of scholars outside the field of education, like Sophia Noble and Rua Benjamin. And they've often asked questions about where's technology taking us. And I think if you look at the work of media ecologists too, like Neil Postman and others, they also point out that technology always has varied effects. It's never exclusively positive or exclusively negative. It extends and amplifies oftentimes what's already in society and shifts things. And so if we can go to the next slide, I'll kind of talk about the way we framed this paper. So you can see one thing we talked about is it's important to recognize that these technologies that we use oftentimes in education don't come to us, out of nowhere. They often come to us from corporations and companies and developers who want to make profits. And so there's often a capitalist profit motive. And so we also use a lot of ed tech that's not really meant to be ed tech, right? It's just technology that we often take and we try to apply in schools. And it's important to always consider the capitalist motives of different companies and corporations. I know early in my career, I used a lot of social media kind of without thinking about that, and later felt a little bit of regret about not having more discussions with my students about data privacy and data protection and things like that. While we're really good at thinking about protecting their data in schools with things like FERPA, we put students online oftentimes without asking those same questions digitally. And so EdTech also tends to often presume a modernist ontology of technology as progress. And what we pointed out there is seeing technology as always helping or being better in schools. And we go back to people like Neil Postman, who ask us to think about what does technology undo when we use it? What does it take away? And we think those questions actually can help us be better educators when we ask them. But sometimes if you have to spend 13 minutes of your 50-minute class period getting the text fixed, you may have lost more than you gained in an educational experience. Sometimes when we think about putting everybody on individual devices, we lose a social component of learning that schools ought to provide. And so thinking about that technology is not simply progress. And I think Neil Selwyn's book he wrote a few years ago where he asked the very question, is technology good for education? Was an important question we need to remind ourselves of. And then our last part there was that EdTech tends to often rationalize social harms, and that oftentimes the people who develop things will make the choices about the trade-offs for us. Right now we're doing this call on Zoom, and if you've been paying attention to the news over the last week, everyone was really excited to get on Zoom, and it's within a few days we started realizing Zoom had terrible privacy policies that not only were not being correctly implemented, they were false. They actually have lies in their terms of service that promise things like end-to-end encryption, which they just weren't providing. And so we have to be really careful about before we jump into using technologies, that we actually take time to think about the ethical issues around them. And so that we finish that sentence in there. This is all one sentence. We broke it up into bullet points there, that EdTech does all of these things, and through a neoliberal lens that burdens individual users with the responsibility for finding fixes to design drawbacks and any negative social implications. And so we think educators should take on this role so that, and even before we adopt certain technologies, to think about it. So what we then talk about in the paper is, we're not going to go over the whole paper because, again, like others, we'd love for you to read it. But we talk about foregrounding technoethics via legal, ethical, and socially responsible considerations. And that's what's in TETC number 9. So what we're really arguing is, before we start using technologies in our classes, what if we skipped forward to TETC 9 and started asking those ethical questions about, should we use this technology in our class? And so you think about what laws already exist, but we didn't frame it just as what laws exist. We thought what laws should exist. We tried to take a more broad perspective, kind of like Martin Luther King does in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, when he says, you know, we should ensure that laws are just laws are worth following. And so if our laws don't take care of things, then we should, as educators, be advocating alongside our students for more just laws. We wanted to take a look at technoethics, and we go all the way back to Mario Bunge, who really was the first one who brought in technoethics in the 70s. And he brought it specifically to the people in Silicon Valley doing the development of technologies, and said, hey, we really need to have better policies about thinking about what is ethical technology development. And these are issues that come into the present, right? You think of all the scandals that Facebook has had, because Facebook has a motive to make money and get engagement, regardless of what the engagement looks like, even if it's negative, harmful, in some cases even leads to the support of genocide in Myanmar, which Facebook took a lot of blame from the United Nations for their role. And so we think about ethics from that. And then a lot of, recently we've been reading a lot of feminist technoethicists who talk about looking at the people who are impacted by technologies and helping students see who are the people that are most vulnerable, who are the targets of the problems that come about from technologies, whether it's drone warfare that's framed as protecting people, but often is harming certain people and protecting other people, and thinking about that within an ed tech sphere too. And then finally, the socially responsible considerations, which we think speaks to democracy. And we think even beyond social responsibility, we should think about justice. What are the just ways to use technologies in schools to ensure that they are not doing harm? And you can see on here, I pointed out Google. Google is very popular in schools. When I've gone to ISTE, for example, you can see 30, 40, 50 sessions on Google, and 0 that focus on Google having invented a new model of extraction of our personal data that Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. And we don't talk about how Google has really used schools as a marketplace and made products cheap to take from our students their personal data and to try to make them lifelong consumers. And so Google really deserves a lot more critical questions. Their search engine has all kinds of problems that they haven't taken responsibility for. I point out Facebook there, which is a popular one. I don't have to say more about the problems Facebook has had. And then I have ClassDojo. ClassDojo is used widely in schools and really is an instrument of behaviorism, in my opinion. There's a lot of other scholars that have written about that. But we also, what it does is, I think Ruha Benjamin talks about the ways that instruments like ClassDojo can be used to conceal teachers that decisions make. And so out comes the objective data. Your student is in the red. And in my local school district here, they actually put students in, what they call lonely islands, where they have to sit on their own. So that just helps us kind of go through it. And Marie will talk about what the implications are for the future research.
Great, thanks, Dan. Hi, I'm Marie Heath, and I'm going to take over with our implications for teacher preparation and for future research. So, like Dan said, we think that TETC 9 is a great place to actually start to have a conversation where we can think about teaching with technologies, not just the ways that we teach teachers, that we can teach teachers how to teach with technology, so that we're not teaching them how to do it, we're teaching them about it, so that they can begin to consider those ethical implications. So we set up a worksheet here, and then in our paper we have a table that explicates it further. Questions for your students to consider, and Dan actually stole my Zoom example. I think it's so timely that if we had done this, if we sat together quickly as a class and knew we were going to teach, I teach almost exclusively online, and did this and thought about what are the ethical implications of Zoom, we tried to add on to the ethical, legal, and socially responsible implications. We added in democratic, which Dan had alluded to. We think about that in the ways that it's sort of tethered to moral understandings of justice across all intersections of identity, and particularly those who have been historically marginalized for us, from our perspective, the United States, but worldwide and globally. And so we added on to socially responsible by terming that democratic. We also added in economic, and thinking about economic justice, technological uses and design, and pedagogical uses. And so for each of those things, we designed a series of questions, and then in our paper, we go into what possible ways that we could use that. So we ask, for the economic justice, we're thinking about the ways that who is the technology profiting? Who is it designed for? Is it exploitative in its practices in terms of extraction of resources? There are resources that are needed for technology that can be environmentally extractive and exploitative to different places. So something for us to consider before we decide. It doesn't mean that I don't use my iPhone, but it does mean that I should at least be aware of where the materials for my iPhone came from. For democratic, does this constrain or afford democracy and justice for all people and groups? Thinking about the ways, for instance, that digital citizens should engage in democratic practices that would be participatory or justice oriented. How does technology privilege or marginalize students at the intersections of their identity? For instance, race and language, culture, gender, sexual orientation, class, disability, religion, age. So we ask that, before, if we took Zoom and we asked those questions, we could do that with Zoom, we could do that with Google Classroom. We suggest that, as Dan said, we consider the legal implications, and not just, is it legal for us? Does this follow FERPA? But in fact, is this law that we are following a just law? So for instance, Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, it said, does it provide too much cover for social media companies, basically too much leeway to avoid monitoring violent speech on their platforms? What are we overlooking when we say it's legal for us to use this, but is that really, is that a floor or a ceiling, and are the laws just? We also think about the technology itself and how it's designed. So what is the problem that the technology claims to solve? And is technology actually the solution to the problem, or is the solution a societal or an educational problem, or a societal and educational problem that we are trying to solve with technology? And then finally, pedagogical. And I think a lot of our colleagues here in this discussion have talked about the intersections of technology and pedagogy and TPAC, and the importance of making sure that we consider that as we integrate technology. But in particular, technologies, for instance, the Class Dojo example, can either replace, amplify, or transform learning experiences. And educators could focus on the benefits of technologies without considering their pedagogical drawbacks, and including those technical ethical concerns. And we'd like to make sure that our teachers are thinking about those things before they adopt and implement a technology. And so we hope that this worksheet provides sort of a starting place to think through that with our teachers, because we think that's actually the place we start. And then we think about, is this a technology we want to integrate?
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Marie. Before I turn it back to Teresa for some final comments, I'd like to just, on behalf of my colleagues, the co-editors of this journal, thank all of the panelists today for your contributions to the journal and for your contributions today on the panel. Thank you. I will turn it back to Teresa now, who has some final remarks. Teresa?
Well, I am super impressed with everybody's work. I just want to express, like Kevin, what an honor it was to serve as the guest editor for this special issue. we had a lot of papers come in for this, and these 5 were the ones that were selected to be published in JTATE. And what's really interesting for me to think about is the passion, the talents, the interests of all of you are all surrounding this idea that all teacher educators need to be responsible for addressing technology, right? But we all found our own little niches. And the purpose of this session here today was to help other researchers maybe be a part of that niche and connect with your papers and learn where they can go in terms of future research. You guys were quick on the uptake. You found the TETCs quickly. They captured your interest, and you developed amazing studies that were published and that will be read. And I'm hoping to see a lot of activity, but also a lot of further research by you, right? And then by others in the field as well. Another interesting thing for me as I was listening to all of you was to see not only that each of these papers were very distinct in terms of where they came from and the angle on the TETCs, but there was also some really interesting overlaps that I had never actually observed before this, this presentation. So thank you again for everybody coming and for all those who are out in site listening to this presentation. Appreciate all of this effort to go online and make it happen.